The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains as Samuel Thompson stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. His weathered boots creaked against the old wooden planks as he surveyed his modest ranch that stretched toward the horizon. At 62 years old, Samuel had seen more sunrises from this same spot than he could count. But something felt different about this particular morning. The cattle were restless in the distance, their low mooing carrying on the gentle breeze that swept across the grassland. Samuel's border collie, Rex, suddenly perked up his ears and let out a low growl, his black and white fur standing on end. The old rancher squinted his eyes, trying to make sense of what had disturbed his faithful companion. "What is it, boy?" Samuel asked, setting down his coffee cup and placing a reassuring hand on Rex's head. The dog's tail remained rigid. His nose pointed toward the eastern ridge that bordered Samuel's property. Samuel had lived on this land for 35 years, ever since he returned from the war that had changed everything. He'd bought the ranch, with his military savings and the small inheritance his father had left him. It wasn't much, just 800 acres of rolling grassland with a modest house, a barn that had seen better days, and enough pasture to support a small herd of cattle. But it was his, and that meant everything to a man who had spent too many years sleeping in foreign fields under hostile skies. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and the small town of Cedar Falls was a good 20-mile drive down, a dirt road that became nearly impassable during the spring rains. Samuel preferred the isolation. After what he'd witnessed during his time in service, the quiet solitude of ranch life felt like a blessing rather than a burden. Rex continued to growl, his attention fixed on something Samuel couldn't yet see. The rancher walked to the edge of his porch and shaded his eyes with his calloused hand. The morning light was still low on the horizon, creating a hazy glare that made it difficult to distinguish shapes in the distance. Then he saw them. At first, it looked like a dark line moving slowly along the ridge. Samuel thought it might be a herd of wild horses which occasionally passed through the area during their seasonal migrations. But as the figures drew closer, their formation became more distinct, more purposeful. These weren't animals moving randomly across the landscape. These were people, and they were moving with military precision. Samuel's heart began to beat faster as memories he'd tried to bury came flooding back. The sight of soldiers in formation triggered something deep in his mind, a trained response that had kept him alive during the darkest days of his youth. His hand instinctively moved to his hip, where his service pistol used to hang before he remembered he was standing on his own front porch, not in some distant battlefield. "Easy, Sam," he whispered to himself, using the calming technique his army psychiatrist had taught him decades ago. "You're home, you're safe." But as the line of figures continued to approach, Samuel realized this wasn't a flashback or a trick of his troubled mind. These people were real, and they were heading directly toward his ranch. He counted them as best he could from the distance. There appeared to be at least 70 or 80 individuals, maybe more. They moved in a single file line, maintaining equal spacing between each person, their pace steady and deliberate. Samuel hurried back into his house, Rex following close behind. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the binoculars he kept on the kitchen windowsill for watching wildlife. Through the magnified lenses, the approaching figures became clearer, and what he saw made his blood run cold. They were warriors, each one dressed in traditional Native American regalia. Feathered headdresses caught the morning light, and the rhythmic movement of their steps created small clouds of dust that drifted behind them like smoke signals. Some carried staffs adorned with eagle feathers and beaded decorations. Others held what appeared to be ceremonial weapons, tomahawks, war clubs, and decorated shields that reflected the sun's rays. Samuel lowered the binoculars, his mind racing. He had read about the history of this land, knew that it had once been home to several Native American tribes before the government had forced them onto reservations hundreds of miles away. But that had happened long before he'd purchased the ranch. As far as he knew, no Native Americans had lived in this area for over a century. Yet here they were, moving across his land with a purpose he couldn't understand. Samuel felt a mixture of fear and curiosity wash over him. Were they here to reclaim their ancestral territory? Were they seeking revenge for past injustices? Or was this something else entirely? He picked up his old rotary phone and dialed the sheriff's office in Cedar Falls, but the line was busy. He tried again, then realized it was still early morning on a Sunday, and Sheriff Martinez probably wouldn't be in his office for another few hours. Samuel's nearest neighbor, Bill Henderson, lived too far away to call for immediate help, and by the time anyone could arrive, these warriors would have already reached his property. Samuel returned to his porch, binoculars in hand, and watched as the line of warriors crested the ridge and began their descent toward his ranch. Rex had stopped growling and now sat beside his master, his intelligent eyes also focused on the approaching figures. The dog seemed to sense that whatever was happening, it was significant. As the warriors drew closer, Samuel could see more details of their appearance. Their faces were painted with traditional designs in red, white, and black pigments. Some wore full headdresses with dozens of eagle feathers that flowed behind them as they walked. Others had simpler adornments, single feathers tied into their long black hair, or bands of beadwork across their foreheads. Their clothing was a mixture of traditional and modern elements. Many wore buckskin shirts and leggings decorated with intricate beadwork and fringe. Others had incorporated modern materials into their regalia, denim vests adorned with native designs, or boots instead of traditional moccasins. Each warrior carried himself with dignity and purpose, their faces serious but not hostile. Samuel realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, something that would change his understanding of his place in this vast landscape. These warriors weren't random visitors or threats to be feared. They were here for a reason, and that reason was about to transform everything Samuel thought he knew about his quiet ranch and his simple life. The sun climbed higher in the sky as the warriors continued their approach, and Samuel Thompson stood on his porch, waiting to discover what fate had brought to his doorstep on this morning that had started like any other. Samuel watched in fascination as the line of warriors reached the bottom of the ridge and began crossing the open pasture toward his ranch house. Now that they were closer, he could see there were exactly 100 of them, each maintaining perfect spacing in their single-file formation. Their movements were synchronized, almost ceremonial, as if they were performing an ancient ritual that had been practiced for generations. The lead warrior was an elderly man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent under the prairie sun. His silver hair was braided with leather strips and small bones, and his headdress contained more feathers than any of the others. As he walked, the beadwork on his shirt caught the morning light, creating tiny flashes of color that seemed to dance with each step. Behind him followed warriors of various ages, from young men who appeared to be in their 20s to grizzled veterans who moved with the careful precision of those who had seen many battles. Some of the younger warriors glanced curiously at Samuel's house, but most kept their eyes fixed straight ahead, following their leader with unwavering discipline. Samuel noticed that despite their fearsome appearance, none of the warriors appeared to be carrying modern weapons. Their tomahawks and war clubs were clearly ceremonial pieces, polished and decorated rather than sharpened for combat. This observation helped calm his nerves somewhat, though he remained puzzled about their intentions. Rex suddenly stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, his tail beginning to wag slowly. The dog's change in demeanor surprised Samuel, as Rex was typically wary of strangers. But somehow the border collie seemed to sense that these visitors posed no threat. When the lead warrior was about 50 yards from the house, he raised his right hand, and the entire line came to a halt with military precision. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat in the sudden silence that followed. Even the cattle in the distance had stopped their lowing, as if the entire ranch was holding its breath. The elderly leader stepped forward alone, his moccasined feet making almost no sound on the dry grass. As he approached the porch, Samuel could see the deep lines etched into his bronze face, each one telling a story of hardship, wisdom, and endurance. His dark eyes were sharp and intelligent, studying Samuel with the same intensity that Samuel was studying him. "Samuel Thompson," the warrior said, his voice carrying easily across the morning air. His English was perfect, with only a slight accent that gave his words a musical quality. "We have come to see you." Samuel was stunned. Not only did this man know his name, but he spoke as if their meeting had been planned long in advance. "How do you know who I am?" Samuel asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. The elderly warrior smiled, and the expression transformed his stern features into something almost grandfatherly. "My name is Joseph Standing Bear. My people have known of you for many years, Samuel Thompson. We know of your service to this country, and we know of the sacrifices you have made." Samuel's mind reeled. How could these people know about his military service? He had never spoken of his time in the war with anyone in Cedar Falls, preferring to keep those memories buried deep. Yet this man spoke as if he had access to Samuel's most private history. "I don't understand," Samuel said, stepping down from his porch and walking closer to Joseph Standing Bear. Rex followed at his heels, no longer showing any signs of concern. "What do you want with me?" Joseph's expression grew more serious. 43 years ago, in a place very far from here, you saved the life of a young soldier. That soldier was my grandson, David Standing Bear. He served under your command during the conflict in Southeast Asia." Samuel's knees nearly buckled as the memory came flooding back. David Standing Bear, he remembered now, a 19-year-old kid from Montana who had been assigned to Samuel's unit during his second tour of duty. David had been eager to prove himself, sometimes recklessly so, and Samuel had often found himself pulling the young soldier back from dangerous situations. "David," Samuel whispered, the name carrying the weight of decades. "Is he?" "He is alive and well," Joseph said, his smile returning. "He is married now with children and grandchildren of his own. He lives on our reservation in Montana, where he teaches young people about the old ways while also preparing them for the modern world." Samuel felt tears welling up in his eyes. During the war, soldiers came and went so frequently that it was often impossible to keep track of what happened to them after they left his unit. He had wondered about David many times over the years, hoping the young man had made it home safely. "David never forgot what you did for him," Joseph continued. "He told us the story many times around our fires, how you risked your own life to pull him from the burning helicopter after it was shot down, how you carried him for 3 miles through enemy territory to reach the evacuation point, how you gave him your own rations when he was too injured to forage for food." Samuel shook his head. "I was just doing my job. Any soldier would have done the same, but not any soldier did do the same," Joseph replied firmly. "You did. And because of your actions, my grandson lived to return home, to marry, to have children, and to pass on our traditions to the next generation. Your courage ensured that our bloodline would continue, that our stories would be told, and that our culture would survive." The elderly warrior paused, looking back at the line of 100 warriors who still stood motionless in Samuel's pasture. "David is now our tribal elder, responsible for maintaining our history and teaching our young people. Before he could fully accept this role, he felt he had a debt that needed to be repaid." Samuel was overwhelmed by the implications of what he was hearing. "But I never asked for anything in return. I never expected anything." "We know," Joseph said gently. "That is precisely why you deserve our honor. You acted not for reward or recognition, but from the goodness of your heart. You saved one of our own when you had no obligation to do so, when it would have been easier and safer to leave him behind." The morning sun had climbed higher, and the light was beginning to reveal more details of the warrior's regalia. Samuel could see that each man wore something different. Some had bear claws incorporated into their necklaces. Others wore shirts decorated with geometric patterns that seemed to tell stories through their designs. Despite their individual differences, they all shared the same dignified bearing, the same sense of purpose that had brought them to this remote ranch. "David asked us to find you," Joseph explained. "It took us many years to track you down after you left the service. We learned that you had moved to this place, that you lived quietly and kept to yourself. We respected your privacy and waited for the right time to approach you." Samuel was curious about what had made this the right time, but before he could ask, Joseph continued speaking. 3 months ago, David received word that you were facing difficulties. The bank is threatening to foreclose on your ranch because of debts from your cattle operation. The drought last year devastated your pastures, and the loss of most of your herd left you unable to make your loan payments. Samuel stared at the elderly warrior in amazement. The financial troubles Joseph described were accurate, but Samuel had told no one about them. He had been struggling alone, trying to figure out how to save the ranch that had become his sanctuary and his home. "How could you possibly know about that?" Samuel asked. Joseph's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. "David's youngest son works for the federal government. He has ways of learning about the difficulties faced by veterans, especially those who served with honor, but have been forgotten by the system that once needed their service." The revelation that David's family had been watching over him from a distance, ensuring his welfare without his knowledge, moved Samuel deeply. He had lived for so long believing that his wartime service had been forgotten, that his sacrifice had meant nothing in the larger scheme of things. Joseph Standing Bear reached into a leather pouch that hung at his side and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. He carefully unfolded the covering to reveal an eagle feather, perfectly preserved and decorated with intricate beadwork in red, white, and blue patterns. This feather belonged to David's great-great-grandfather, a warrior who fought alongside General Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn, Joseph said, holding the feather reverently. But unlike the stories white men tell about that battle, David's ancestor fought not for glory or conquest, but to protect his family and his people's way of life. Samuel listened intently as Joseph continued the story. After the battle, David's great-great-grandfather realized that the old ways of fighting would no longer work. The world was changing, and his people would need to find new ways to survive and protect what mattered most to them. He began teaching the younger warriors that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons but with wisdom, patience, and honor. The elderly warrior extended the feather toward Samuel. "This feather has been passed down through 5 generations of David's family, always held by the warrior who best embodied those principles. David carried it throughout his time in the war, and he believes it helped keep him alive when death seemed certain." Samuel hesitated to take such a precious family heirloom. "I can't accept this. It belongs to your family, to your people. You became part of our family the moment you risked your life for David," Joseph replied firmly. "In our tradition, when someone saves the life of a tribal member, they become bound to that tribe forever. You are our brother, Samuel Thompson, whether you knew it or not." With trembling hands, Samuel accepted the eagle feather. The moment it touched his palm, he felt a strange sensation, as if the feather was warm with the energy of all the warriors who had carried it before him. The beadwork was incredibly detailed, with tiny glass beads sewn in patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the morning light. "But we did not come here only to honor you with gifts," Joseph said, his expression becoming more serious. "We came to offer our help. David learned that you have 60 days remaining before the bank takes your ranch. He also learned that you need $47,000 to save your home." Samuel's face flushed with embarrassment. His financial problems were deeply personal, and having them discussed by strangers made him feel vulnerable and exposed. "I appreciate your concern, but I can't accept charity. I've gotten by on my own for 35 years and I'll figure something out." Joseph nodded approvingly. "David said you would respond exactly that way. He told us that your pride and independence were part of what made you such a good soldier and leader. But this is not charity, Samuel Thompson. This is repayment of a debt that has been owed for 43 years." The elderly warrior gestured toward the line of 100 warriors who still stood motionless in the pasture. "Each of these men represents a different tribe from across the western states. Word of David's story has traveled far among our people, carried from reservation to reservation by the old networks that connected our ancestors, long before white men drew lines on maps." Samuel looked at the assembled warriors with new understanding. They weren't all from the same tribe or even the same region. They had traveled hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles to be here. Every tribe has stories of warriors who never returned from distant battles, Joseph explained. Fathers, sons, brothers who died far from home, their bodies never recovered, their families never knowing what became of them. When our people heard about a white soldier who had risked everything to save a Native American warrior, who had ensured that at least one of our sons came home alive, they wanted to honor that deed. Joseph paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Each warrior standing in your pasture has brought a gift. Not money, but something more valuable. A piece of their tribe's history, their culture, their most precious possessions. Samuel was overwhelmed by the implications of what he was hearing. I don't understand. What does this have to do with saving my ranch? 3 months ago, when David learned of your troubles, he sent messengers to every reservation within 1,000 miles of this place, Joseph said. He asked each tribe to contribute something to help the man who had saved his life. Some tribes sent jewelry made by their finest artisans. Others sent pottery, blankets woven by grandmothers who had learned the techniques from their grandmothers. Still others sent ceremonial items that had been in their families for generations. Joseph's eyes grew bright with pride as he continued. The response was greater than David had ever imagined. Tribes that had been enemies in the old days put aside their differences to honor your deed. Warriors who had never met you felt compelled to make the journey to this place, to see for themselves the man who had shown such courage and compassion. Samuel looked again at the line of warriors, seeing them now not as a potential threat, but as representatives of dozens of different communities who had somehow been touched by a story about a moment of humanity in the midst of war. But I still don't understand how this helps with my financial problems, Samuel said. Joseph smiled mysteriously. Yesterday morning, these 100 warriors visited the auction house in Denver, the largest in the region. They brought with them the gifts that their tribes had sent. Hundreds of pieces of authentic Native American art, jewelry, pottery, and ceremonial items. The auction house owner had never seen such a collection. Samuel's eyes widened as he began to understand. They sold the items? Every single piece, Joseph confirmed. The auction drew collectors from across the country. People bid against each other for the chance to own authentic tribal artifacts, especially when they learned the story behind the collection, that these items were being sold to help a veteran who had once saved the life of a Native American soldier. Joseph reached into another pouch and withdrew a thick envelope. The auction raised $68,000. After the auction house took their commission, there is enough money to pay off your debt to the bank and have several $1,000s remaining to help you rebuild your cattle herd. Samuel stared at the envelope, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. His legs felt weak and he had to sit down on the porch steps to steady himself. Rex immediately came over and placed his head on Samuel's knee, as if sensing his master's emotional state. I can't accept this, Samuel said, though his voice lacked conviction. It's too much. You've all sacrificed too much. The only sacrifice would be allowing you to lose this ranch, Joseph replied. David told us how much this land means to you, how it gave you peace after the war. He said that losing this place would be like losing a part of your soul. Samuel felt tears streaming down his cheeks. For decades he had carried the burden of his wartime experiences alone, believing that his service had been forgotten, that his sacrifices had made no lasting difference. Now he was learning that a single act of courage and compassion had rippled outward, through generations and across tribal boundaries, creating connections he had never imagined. There is more, Joseph said gently. The warriors did not come here only to deliver money and honor you with gifts. They came to offer you something that cannot be bought with any amount of money. Samuel looked up through his tears, wondering what else these extraordinary people could possibly have to offer. They came to offer you a family, Joseph said. David wants you to know that you are welcome on our reservation anytime you choose to visit. You will always have a place at our fires, a seat at our table, and a voice in our councils. The same is true for every tribe represented here today. Joseph gestured toward the assembled warriors. 100 men have traveled great distances to be here this morning. They did not come because they had to, but because they wanted to. They came because they believe that honor must be repaid, that courage must be recognized, and that no warrior should face his battles alone. The elderly warrior's voice grew stronger, more ceremonial. You saved one of our own when it would have been easier to let him die. Because of your actions, David lived to become a teacher, A father, a grandfather, and a keeper of our traditions. The children he taught, the stories he preserved, the wisdom he passed on. All of this exists because you chose to be brave when bravery was needed most. Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his weathered hand and stood up slowly. The envelope containing his ranch's salvation still clutched in his other hand. The weight of Joseph's words settled over him like a warm blanket, but he still struggled to fully comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. "I need to ask you something," Samuel said, his voice steadier now. "How did David remember so much about what happened? The war was chaos. We all did things to help each other survive. Why did that one incident mean so much to him?" Joseph's expression grew thoughtful, and he glanced back at the line of warriors before answering. "David told me that when he was lying in that crashed helicopter, listening to enemy soldiers searching for survivors, he was certain he was going to die. Not just die, but die alone, thousands of miles from his family, his tribe, his sacred places." The elderly warrior paused, his eyes distant as if he were seeing the events through David's memories. "He said he could hear you moving around outside the wreckage, and he assumed you were gathering supplies or weapons before leaving him behind. That's what he would have expected. That's what war taught soldiers to do. Save yourself first, because dead heroes can't help anyone." Samuel remembered that day with painful clarity now that the memories had been unlocked. The helicopter had been shot down during what should have been a routine supply mission. The pilot and co-pilot had been killed instantly, but David had been thrown clear of the main impact. Samuel had been in another helicopter that had been forced to land nearby due to mechanical problems. "But instead of leaving, you crawled into that burning wreckage," Joseph continued. "David said he heard you calling his name, asking if he was alive. When he answered, you told him you were going to get him out, that you weren't going anywhere without him." Samuel felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied these memories. "The fuel was leaking. I knew the whole thing could explode at any moment." "David knew that too," Joseph said. "That's what made your actions so extraordinary. You had every reason to save yourself, every excuse to leave him behind. The enemy was closing in, the helicopter was on fire, and you barely knew him. But you chose to risk everything for someone else's grandson, someone else's son." Joseph reached into his shirt and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to Samuel, who recognized it immediately. It was a picture of David's unit, taken just a few weeks before the helicopter crash. Samuel was in the back row, his arm around David's shoulders, both of them grinning despite the circumstances of their deployment. "David has carried this photograph for 43 years, Joseph said. "He showed it to his children when they were old enough to understand war. He showed it to his grandchildren when they asked about the scars on his legs. And when he became a tribal elder, he used your story to teach young warriors about the difference between courage and recklessness." Samuel studied the photograph, remembering how young they had all been, how invincible they had felt despite the dangers surrounding them every day. "I was just 24 years old myself. We were all just kids trying to stay alive and get home." "But you didn't just try to get yourself home," Joseph pointed out. "You made sure David got home too. And because of that choice, he was able to live long enough to become the man his tribe needed him to be." Joseph gestured toward the assembled warriors. "David told me that every time he taught a young person about our traditional ways, every time he helped settle a dispute between tribal members, every time he performed a ceremony that kept our culture alive, he thought about you. He wondered where you were, whether you had found peace after the war, whether anyone had ever thanked you for what you did." The morning sun was now high enough to illuminate the faces of all 100 warriors, and Samuel could see the diversity of their appearances. Some had the high cheekbones and angular features typical of Plains tribes, while others showed the broader faces common among Pacific Northwest peoples. Despite their different origins, they all shared the same expression of respectful attention. "When David learned that you were in trouble, he said it felt like a sign," Joseph continued. "For decades, he had wanted to find a way to repay your kindness, but he didn't know how to locate you or what you might need. When his son discovered that you were facing foreclosure, David saw it as an opportunity to finally balance the scales." Samuel shook his head in amazement. "All this time I thought I was forgotten. After I left the service, it seemed like nobody cared about what any of us had done over there. The country just wanted to move on and pretend the war had never happened. David never forgot, Joseph said firmly. And when he shared your story with other tribal elders, they didn't forget either. Your actions became part of our oral tradition, passed down alongside the stories of our own warriors and heroes. Joseph turned and raised his hand toward the line of warriors. At his signal, they began to move, but instead of continuing toward the house, they spread out across Samuel's pasture in a large circle. Each warrior found a position exactly the same distance from Samuel's porch, creating a perfect ring of Iwis honor guards surrounding the ranch house. "What are they doing?" Samuel asked, though something deep in his memory stirred with recognition. "They are performing a ceremony that has not been seen for over a century," Joseph explained. "It is called the Circle of Honor, and it was traditionally reserved for warriors who had shown extraordinary courage in protecting others. The last time this ceremony was performed was for a cavalry officer who refused to abandon wounded soldiers during an Indian attack in 1887. Samuel watched in awe as each warrior planted his staff or spear in the ground and then knelt on one knee, their heads bowed in a gesture of profound respect. The sight was both beautiful and overwhelming, a living mandala of humanity spread across his simple ranch. "They will remain in this position until sunrise tomorrow," Joseph said. "It is their way of showing that your courage deserves to be remembered, not just with words but with actions that require sacrifice. They have traveled great distances to be here, and they will spend the night on your land without shelter or comfort, maintaining their vigil until the ceremony is complete." Samuel felt his knees go weak again. "They can't do that. It's supposed to get cold tonight and they don't have any supplies." Joseph smiled. "These are warriors, Samuel Thompson. They have endured much worse conditions than a single night on the prairie. This is their choice, their honor to give. To try to stop them would be to insult the very courage they came here to celebrate." The elderly warrior placed a gentle hand on Samuel's shoulder. "There is something else you should know. David wanted to be here himself, but his health no longer allows such long journeys. However, he sent his grandson to represent him." Joseph pointed to one of the younger warriors in the circle, a man who appeared to be in his early 30s. "That is Michael Standing Bear, David's eldest grandson. He is a teacher on our reservation just as his grandfather was. He has heard the story of your courage every year since he was old enough to understand words." Samuel studied the young man, seeing in his features an echo of the 19-year-old soldier he had pulled from the burning helicopter so many decades ago. The connection between past and present, between one act of compassion and its ripple effects across generations, suddenly became crystal clear. "Michael carries a message from his grandfather," Joseph continued. "David wants you to know that because of your actions, he was able to raise 4 children who became teachers, doctors, and tribal leaders. Those children had children of their own, and those grandchildren are now having children. Your moment of courage in that burning helicopter ensured that dozens of people exist who would never have been born otherwise." The magnitude of this revelation hit Samuel like a physical blow. He had always thought of his war service in terms of duty and survival, never considering the long-term consequences of individual acts of kindness. Now he was learning that a single decision made in a moment of crisis had created an entire family, tree of people whose lives were possible only because he had chosen compassion over self-preservation. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, Samuel found himself sitting on his porch with Joseph Standing Bear, sharing stories and watching the incredible sight of 100 warriors maintaining their vigil across his ranch. Rex had settled contentedly between the two men, occasionally lifting his head to observe the still figures scattered across the pasture. "I keep thinking this must be a dream," Samuel said, sipping from a cup of coffee he had brought out for Joseph. "This morning I woke up thinking I might lose everything I've worked for. Now I'm surrounded by warriors from tribes I didn't even know existed, and they're telling me that something I barely remember has been remembered by them for over 40 years. Joseph smiled and accepted the coffee gratefully. Dreams and reality are not always as different as white men believe. In our tradition, what happens in dreams can be as important as what happens while awake. Perhaps this day exists somewhere between the two." Samuel watched as a gentle breeze stirred the feathers on the warriors' headdresses, but not one of them moved from their positions. How do they maintain such discipline? They've been kneeling there for hours without moving. They are thinking about what brought them here, Joseph explained. Each warrior has his own reason for making this journey. Some had relatives who died in distant wars and were never brought home. Others have heard their grandfathers tell stories about the old days when warriors from different tribes could find common ground in honoring courage wherever they found it. Joseph pointed to a warrior near the edge of the circle, whose headdress contained black and white feathers arranged in a distinctive pattern. That man is Thomas Crowfeather from the Blackfeet Nation in Montana. His great-grandfather was killed at Wounded Knee in 1890, and his body was never returned to the family for proper burial. Thomas believes that by honoring your courage, he is also honoring all the warriors who died far from home. Samuel felt a lump forming in his throat. I had no idea that what happened in that helicopter would mean so much to so many people. That is often how the most important actions work, Joseph replied. The people who perform truly courageous acts rarely understand their full significance at the time. They simply do what needs to be done, without thinking about glory or recognition. Joseph gestured toward another warrior, this one wearing a shirt decorated with geometric patterns in blue and yellow. That is Robert Windwalker from the Pueblo tribes in New Mexico. His son is currently serving in Afghanistan, and Robert wanted to pay respect to someone who had brought a soldier home safely, hoping that someone might do the same for his own child. Samuel understood immediately. The connections between past and present, between one generation's sacrifices and another's hopes, were woven throughout this gathering. Every one of them has a personal reason for being here, don't they? Every single one, Joseph confirmed. David's story traveled through our communities like wildfire spreading across dry grass. Each tribe added their own interpretation, their own understanding of what your actions meant. Some saw it as proof that not all white soldiers viewed Native Americans as enemies. Others saw it as an example of the kind of warrior our young people should strive to become. Joseph paused to take another sip of coffee before continuing, but perhaps the most powerful response came from the tribal elders who remembered stories their own grandfathers had told them about white soldiers who had shown mercy or kindness during the Indian Wars. Your story reminded them that even in the worst of times, individual human beings can choose to act with honor. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of these revelations. Joseph, can I ask you something personal? What made you decide to lead this ceremony? What does David's story mean to you specifically? The elderly warrior's expression grew distant, and Samuel could see that the question had touched something deep within him. My own son was killed in Vietnam 3 years before David's unit arrived there. Billy Standing Bear was 19 years old when he died, the same age David was when you saved his life. Samuel felt his heart constrict with sympathy. I'm so sorry for your loss. Joseph nodded slowly. Billy was killed in a helicopter crash, just like the one David survived. When the military sent his body home, they told us he had died instantly, that he didn't suffer, but they never told us if anyone had tried to save him. If anyone had cared enough to risk their own life for a Native American soldier they barely knew. The elderly warrior's voice grew stronger as he continued. When David told me your story, I realized that somewhere in Vietnam, there might have been another soldier like you, someone who would have risked everything to save my Billy if they had been able to reach him in time. That thought gave me a peace I had not felt since we buried my son. Samuel reached over and placed his hand on Joseph's shoulder, a gesture that transcended the cultural differences between them. I'm sure someone would have tried to save Billy if they could have. Most soldiers, no matter what color their skin was, understood that we were all in it together. That is what David always said, Joseph replied. He told us that in combat, tribal differences meant nothing. Soldiers protected each other because they were soldiers, not because of their race or background. He said you never treated him differently because he was Native American. You saw him as your brother in arms, and that was enough. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel began to notice subtle changes in the warriors' positions. Though they remained kneeling, They had slightly adjusted their orientation so that all of them were now facing east, toward the direction from which the sun would rise the following morning. "They're preparing for the night vigil," Joseph explained when Samuel mentioned this observation. "In our tradition, warriors always face the direction of the rising sun when maintaining a watch. It represents hope, renewal, and the promise that even the darkest night will eventually end." Samuel watched as the shadows began to lengthen across his pasture. "Joseph, I have to ask you something that's been bothering me. How did you coordinate all of this? How did you get warriors from dozens of different tribes to come together for someone they've never met?" Joseph's eyes twinkled with what might have been mischief. "You underestimate the power of our communication networks. Long before white men invented telephones and telegraphs, our people had ways of sending messages across vast distances. Some of those networks still exist today." The elderly warrior reached into his pouch and withdrew a small, carved piece of wood. "This is a message stick. When David decided to honor you, he carved symbols into sticks like this one and sent them to tribal leaders throughout the western states. Each symbol told part of your story, your courage, David's survival, the debt that needed to be repaid." Samuel examined the intricate carvings on the stick, recognizing some symbols that seemed to represent fire, flight, and human figures. "How many tribes received these message sticks?" 47, Joseph replied. "From the Seminoles in Florida to the Makah in Washington state, from the Penobscot in Maine to the Tohono O'odham in Arizona. Not every tribe could send a representative, but many more wanted to contribute to your honor than could actually make the journey." Joseph gestured toward a pack that lay beside his position. "In addition to the warriors you see here, we received gifts and messages from tribes that could not attend. There are eagle feathers from the Lakota, turquoise jewelry from the Navajo, traditional blankets from the Cherokee, and carved totems from Pacific Northwest tribes. Each gift represents a tribe's recognition of your courage." Samuel was overwhelmed by the scope of the response to David's call for action. "I never imagined that one moment could ripple outward to touch so many people." "That is the nature of true courage," Joseph said. "It inspires others to be courageous themselves. David's survival allowed him to become a teacher and leader, which inspired countless young people on our reservation. Your story, as David told it, inspired tribal leaders to put aside old differences and work together for a common purpose. And now, the story of this day will inspire future generations to believe that individual acts of kindness can change the world." As evening approached, Samuel insisted on bringing food and water to the kneeling warriors, despite Joseph's protests that such assistance might interfere with the ceremony. The elderly leader finally agreed to allow Samuel to provide basic necessities, but only if Samuel himself carried the supplies to each warrior. Walking among the 100 kneeling figures was one of the most moving experiences of Samuel's life. Each warrior accepted his offerings with a slight nod of acknowledgement, but none spoke or broke their meditative concentration. Some were clearly struggling with fatigue and discomfort, but their determination to complete the vigil never wavered. As Samuel moved from warrior to warrior, he began to notice the incredible diversity of their tribal affiliations. Feathers, beadwork, and clothing styles represented dozens of different Native American cultures, each with its own unique artistic traditions and ceremonial practices. Yet they had all come together for a single purpose: to honor a moment of human decency that had occurred decades earlier in a distant land. When Samuel reached Michael Standing Bear, David's grandson, the young man looked up and spoke softly. "My grandfather asked me to tell you something." Dawn broke slowly over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to set the warriors' feathers ablaze with color. Samuel had barely slept, spending most of the night sitting on his porch with Rex, watching over the 100 figures who maintained their vigil in perfect silence throughout the dark hours. As the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern horizon, all 100 warriors rose to their feet in perfect unison, as if responding to some invisible signal. They remained facing east, their silhouettes dark against the brightening sky, creating a scene that Samuel knew would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. Joseph Standing Bear approached the porch, moving slowly after his long night on the ground. Despite his age and the physical demands of the ceremony, his face radiated a deep satisfaction, as if something important had been completed. "The vigil is finished," Joseph said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "The circle of honor has been maintained from sunset to sunrise as tradition requires. Your courage has been properly witnessed and recorded in the memories of 100 warriors from 47 different tribes." Samuel stood and walked to the edge of his porch, looking out at the assembled warriors who were now beginning to retrieve their staffs and prepare for departure. "Joseph, I don't know how to thank you, all of you. This has been the most extraordinary experience of my life." "The thanks belong to you," Joseph replied. "You gave David the gift of life, and through him you gave all of our communities the gift of his wisdom and leadership. What we have done here is simply the repayment of an old debt." As the warriors began to form their departure formation, Samuel noticed that several of them were approaching the house carrying bundles and packages. Joseph explained that these were additional gifts from tribes that could not send representatives to the ceremony. The first warrior to approach was a woman, something Samuel hadn't noticed in the previous day's activities because she had been positioned on the far side of the circle. She was middle-aged, with graying hair braided with silver ornaments, and she carried herself with the same dignity as the male warriors. "This is Maria Singing Crow from the Crow Nation in Montana," Joseph introduced. "She is our tribal historian and keeper of women's traditions. She wanted to present you with something special." Maria stepped forward and offered Samuel a beautifully crafted blanket woven in patterns of deep blue, red, and white. The design was intricate, with geometric shapes that seemed to tell a story through their arrangement. "This blanket was woven by my grandmother 60 years ago," Maria said, her voice soft but strong. "She made it for my grandfather when he returned from World War II. He carried it with him for the rest of his life, and when he died, it was passed to me. I want you to have it because you represent the same spirit of courage and sacrifice that my grandfather embodied." Samuel accepted the blanket with trembling hands, feeling the soft wool and admiring the perfect craftsmanship. "I can't take something so precious from your family. It belongs with someone who understands its meaning," Maria replied. "My grandmother always said that sacred objects must be kept in motion, passed from one worthy person to another. This blanket has been waiting for the right person to carry it forward." As Maria stepped back, other warriors approached with their gifts. Samuel received pottery from southwestern tribes, intricate beadwork from Plains Indians, carved wooden items from Pacific Northwest peoples, and jewelry made from materials as diverse as turquoise, silver, and shells from distant oceans. Each gift came with a story, a connection to the giver's personal or tribal history. A young warrior from the Seminole tribe presented Samuel with a carved alligator tooth that had been blessed by tribal shamans. An elderly Hopi man gave him a small pottery vessel that had been made using clay from sacred sites in Arizona. But perhaps the most moving gift came from a warrior who appeared to be in his 70s, his face deeply lined with age and experience. He approached Samuel carrying what appeared to be a military medal, its ribbon faded with age. "This is William Strongheart from the Cheyenne Nation," Joseph explained. "He is a veteran of the Korean War." William stepped forward and placed the medal in Samuel's hands. It was a Purple Heart, awarded for wounds received in combat. "I received this medal in 1951 when I was wounded near Seoul," William said, his voice rough with emotion. "For 60 years I have carried it as a reminder of that war and the friends I lost there." William paused, gathering his strength before continuing. "But yesterday, when I heard David's story and learned about your courage, I realized that this medal represents something larger than my own experience. It represents the sacrifice that all warriors make for each other, regardless of their race or background. I want you to have it as a symbol of the brotherhood that connects all who have served." Samuel looked down at the Purple Heart, understanding the magnitude of William's gesture. Military medals were deeply personal awards, representing moments of pain and sacrifice that only veterans could truly understand. For William to give up his Purple Heart was an act of generosity that went beyond anything Samuel could have imagined. "William, I can't accept this," Samuel said. "You earned this medal with your blood. It belongs to you and your family." William shook his head firmly. I earned it, and now I am choosing to pass it on. In our tradition, a warrior's greatest honor comes not from keeping his achievements to himself, but from recognizing the achievements of others. You have earned the right to carry this medal. As the gift-giving ceremony concluded, Joseph called for the attention of all assembled warriors. They gathered in a loose semicircle around Samuel's porch, their faces serious and attentive. "Before we depart," Joseph announced, "there is one final element of this ceremony that must be completed. Samuel Thompson, you have been honored by representatives of 47 different Native American tribes. You have been recognized as a warrior of courage and compassion, but most importantly, you have been adopted into our extended family." Joseph reached into his pouch and withdrew a document written on what appeared to be deerskin parchment. "This is a formal declaration, signed by the tribal leaders of every nation represented here today. It states that you are welcome in any of our communities, that you have a voice in our councils, and that you will always have a place at our fires." Samuel accepted the document, seeing his name written in beautiful calligraphy alongside dozens of signatures and tribal seals. "I don't know what to say. This is more honor than I ever expected or deserved." "You deserve it because you never expected it," Joseph replied. "True warriors do not seek glory for their actions. They act from the heart, doing what is right because it is right, not because they hope for reward." As the warriors began to file past Samuel, each one offering a brief word of gratitude or respect, he realized that this ceremony had changed him as much as it had honored him. For 43 years he had carried the weight of his war experiences largely alone, believing that his service had been forgotten by a country eager to move on from an unpopular conflict. Now he understood that individual acts of courage and compassion create their own legacy, rippling outward through generations in ways that the original actor may never see or understand. David Standing Bear's survival had led to decades of teaching and leadership that had touched countless lives. The story of Samuel's courage had inspired 47 different tribes to put aside their differences and work together for a common purpose. As the last warrior passed by his porch, Samuel felt a profound sense of completion. The ranch that had been threatened with foreclosure was now secure, saved by the generosity of people he had never met, but who had been touched by a story of human decency told around tribal fires for over 4 decades. But more than saving his land, this experience had saved something deeper, his faith in the lasting power of individual goodness. Samuel Thompson had learned that no act of courage, however small or seemingly insignificant, is ever truly forgotten. Somewhere someone remembers. Somewhere someone is inspired to be better because of what they witnessed or heard about. The sun climbed higher and the warriors disappeared over the eastern ridge, heading back to their homes across the vast American landscape. Samuel stood on his porch holding Rex and watching them go. In his hands he clutched the eagle feather that had been passed down through 5 generations of David's family, a symbol of courage that now belonged to him. The silence that followed their departure was not empty but full of possibility, full of connection, full of the understanding that he was no longer alone in the world. Samuel Thompson, the solitary rancher who had awakened that morning thinking he might lose everything, now knew that he was part of a family that stretched across tribal boundaries and state lines, a family united by the simple belief that courage deserves to be honored, and that kindness creates bonds stronger than blood. From that day forward, whenever Samuel looked out across his ranch, he would remember the morning when 100 warriors came to teach him that no good deed is ever forgotten, and that the ripples of compassion can travel farther and last longer than anyone could ever imagine.